Episode 10, The World Economy, circa 1450. Question 1. What new technological improvements helped to usher in a new age of European maritime exploration? How did these technologies help? During the 15th century, a series of technological improvements began to change the balance of maritime power. Europeans developed deep draft, round hulled ships capable of both navigating the notoriously challenging waters of the North Atlantic and of carrying powerful artillery. They were using and improving the compass, cartographic and other navigational aids improved also. New combinations of sails, introduced on ships like the Portuguese caravels, allowed Europeans to take advantage of changing wind conditions. Along with improved ships' hulls, this gave the Europeans the ability to navigate deeper mid-ocean waters. Finally, European knowledge of explosives, borrowed from the Chinese, was adapted to artillery. Increasingly sophisticated metalwork allowed Western metalsmiths to devise the first guns and cannons. The West slowly developed a military advantage over all other civilizations of the world, first primarily on the seas. With an incomparable ability to kill and intimidate from distance, Europe was on the cusp of ascendancy. Question 2. How were the new joint stock trading companies created by the Dutch and British different from the trading mechanisms of the Arab world? How might these differences have given them an advantage? The Netherlands, Britain, and France all chartered massive joint stock companies, such as the Dutch East India Company. These companies were given government monopolies of trade in a designated region, but they were not closely supervised by their state. They had rights to raise armies and coin money on their own. These were semi-private companies, but in practice they functioned as de facto independent states, amassing great amounts of commercial fortunes and territorial gains. A Dutch trading company, for example, effectively ruled the island of Taiwan off the coast of China. The British East India Company similarly acted as a proxy for the British government in India for much of the 18th century. These companies were different from earlier commercial organizations, such as those found in the Arab world and elsewhere. They had larger, experienced bureaucracies and organizational structure, unlike the more shambolic, smaller scale family run enterprises found in much of the Middle East and South Asia. The commercial flexibility allowed these companies to expand much further than was previously thought possible. Question 3. What was the Columbian Exchange? What impact did it have on the Americas? What impact did it have on Europe? The Columbian Exchange refers to the transatlantic transfer of foods, diseases, animals, plants, and people triggered by the arrival of Europeans in the Americas. The impact of this exchange became visible quickly. The extension of contact across the Atlantic spread disease, the greatest victims of which were Native Americans who had no natural immunity to smallpox and measles, and who died by the millions. Some estimates run as high as 80% of the pre-European population. Aside from being a catastrophic human tragedy, this had the twin impacts of facilitating the European conquest of the Americas and causing a labor shortage that would in turn trigger the transatlantic slave trade. Other exchanges were more positive. New World crops such as corn, sweet potatoes, and white potatoes were embraced worldwide, and in the case of the white potato, triggered multiple population explosions in both Asia and Europe. Question 4. What is the connection between the Columbian Exchange and the transatlantic slave trade? The new trading opportunities, in tandem with the extreme population changes, generated new or partially new labor systems. The market demand for sugar in particular, combined with an inadequate or disease-depleted local labor pool, forced the European colonizers to seek alternatives. There were early experiments with indentured servitude, particularly in the British colonies, by which an individual will commit themselves to a set period of servitude, usually 5 to 7 years, in exchange for passage to the New World. This approach did not attract a labor pool anywhere close to meeting the demand. The slave trade, quickly established with the help of pre existing slave states in Africa, had a much more profound impact, with millions ultimately forcibly shipped across the Atlantic. Atlantic slavery bore little resemblance to pre existing slave systems. Not only were greater numbers involved, but plantation owners actively strove to increase discipline and productivity. The Columbian Exchange thus played a major role in the general global effort to increase human labor in the early modern period. Question 5. What was mercantilism and how did it encourage colonialism and imperialism? The dominant core nations of this European dominated global commerce supplemented their growing economic prowess with self serving political policies. The doctrine of mercantilism, which urged that a nation state not import goods from outside its own empire, but sell exports as widely as possible in its own ships, both reflected and encouraged the New World system. At the same time as the global economy shifted from land based to maritime, the nature of the goods being traded also changed. At the beginning, the core European powers sought colonies so they could control a certain commodity, for example, the Dutch monopoly of nutmeg. As the nature of domestic economic production changed, so too did the value of the colonies. European economies were transitioning from exclusively agricultural towards a blended economy increasingly emphasizing trade and manufacture. With goods to sell, European powers needed markets to sell them to. By monopolizing access to their colonial markets, the mercantilistic states were creating their own captive audience. As time went on and the manufacturing economies matured into industrial economies, the value of colonies as markets superseded their values as sources of resources or raw material. Question 6. Why did an international system of inequality develop? Beyond Western Europe lay areas that were increasingly intertwined in the world economy, but with a second class status as dependents to the core nations. These areas produced low cost goods, precious metals, and cash crops such as sugar, spice, tobacco, and later cotton. Human labor was a key item of exchange. Many parts of sub Saharan Africa enter the world economy as suppliers of slaves. The earlier West African patterns of trade across the Sahara had yielded to a dominant focus on the Atlantic and, therefore, to activities organized by Western shippers. In return for slaves and unprocessed goods, Europeans traded their manufactured items, including guns, while profiting from their control of commercial and shipping services. Coercive labor systems spread. Because dependent economies relied on cheap production of unprocessed goods, there was a tendency to build a system of forced labor that would minimize costs even when the local labor supply was unstable. With imperial powers limiting the diversification of the colonial economies, the reliance on inexpensively produced raw materials and the slave systems needed to facilitate that production persisted and proliferated. Question 7. Why did China not recognize the error it had made by conceding international trade to the Europeans? While Europeans were building their maritime empires, Asian states maintained a strong, though distinctive, position in the international trading system. The Chinese government, having withdrawn from large scale global trade with the end of Cheng Hei's voyages of discovery, deliberately avoided involvement in international trade on someone else's terms. China copied some technologies from the West, including firearms, but the extent and sophistication of these efforts were limited. Chinese shipping still transported goods throughout the Philippines and Southeast Asia. Despite increasing disparagement from Westerners decrying the Chinese eschewing of industrial technology in favor of tradition, the Chinese economy remained massive and vibrant. China avoided having to keep up with European advances whilst also avoiding subservience to Western merchants. Such was the global demand for Chinese products that they maintained a substantial trade advantage. Western silver flowed into the imperial coffers. Indeed, Such was the favorability of their position that when a British diplomatic mission visited the imperial court at the end of the 18th century, they were commanded to show extreme deference, following which they were told that the Chinese had no need for outside goods. Thus, the Chinese were both dismissive of and ignorant of advances underway in the West, gauging their position based only on the favorable trade deficit they enjoyed proved illusory in time because eventually demand dropped in favor of industrially produced goods. At the same time, Western industrial military power meant that the Chinese were in an increasingly perilous position. It was this blend of ignorance and arrogance that doomed the Chinese to decline and collapse. Question 8. How did the Spanish monetize their new colonies? Was this a model for sustainable growth? Why were Britain and the Netherlands better equipped to take advantage of the shifting global economy? Early colonies in the Americas were typically founded by groups of gold obsessed Europeans, often only loosely supervised by colonial administrators back home. The pursuit of precious metals did, in fact, pay off with the discovery of the silver mines at Potosi in modern day Bolivia. Regardless of their fortunes elsewhere in the Americas, the Spanish effortlessly turned a profit because of their exports of precious metals. The Spanish failed to take advantage of their extraordinary fortune. The Spanish crown took a 20% cut of all silver mined in the colonies. The remaining 80% went to the holders of the mining licenses, who used the proceeds to supply their colonies with the necessary supplies and also for personal enrichment. The problem was that the Spanish failed to develop a domestic manufacturing capacity. Consequently, much of the profits of the colonies flowed into the Dutch and British coffers. Each had developed both commercial and manufacturing capacities that would sustain long term growth. The Spanish mined so much silver that it caused a massive worldwide inflationary period, which in turn reduced the buying power of Spanish silver, which in turn required the mining of more silver, and so on. Such was the mismanagement of the Spanish economy that it declared bankruptcy 4 times in the late 1500s. When the silver bubble burst, the Spanish colonies pivoted to sugar production as a primary source of revenue. They encountered the same problems of oversupply as with the Potosi silver, exacerbated this time by competition from the British, French, and Dutch. Over reliance on a single crop essentially guarantees an economic volatility, and the Spanish sugar economy did little to improve their overall fiscal health. It would not be until after the sugar boom that the Spanish colonial economy stabilized, albeit at profit levels far short of the silver and sugar days. This was finally a model for at least modest, sustainable growth. Britain, France, and the Dutch were far better suited to thrive in this global maritime economy. Each had developed secondary, that is, manufacturing, and tertiary, trade and banking, economies, which meant that they could be self sufficient while also being suppliers to consumers like the Spanish and the Chinese. The Spanish had such a glut of short term financial success that they had never felt the need to develop a mercantilistic trade model, thus missing out on what would be the true source of imperial power moving forward.